Hello friends, I'm coming at you from the top of Acatenango Volcano in Guatemala, and I just had to make a video because I've been feeling sort of inspired to talk about anxiety the whole way up here, and I want to share some of my insights about it. As you can see, those are clouds below me. That's the volcano behind me. We might actually see it puff up some smoke in a little bit. And the reason I wanted to kind of make a video is because a couple of years ago I would never have been able to stand here on this pretty steep drop-off with pretty much no anxiety above literal clouds. And so I'm gonna share a few of the insights that has sort of made it possible for me to get here. All right, psychitects, so a bit of backstory. I have always had a pretty crippling fear of heights. I know that's a pretty normal thing to be afraid of, but for me it's pretty extreme. I remember going on a football camp retreat and doing the high ropes and annoying everyone else around me because I was shaking so much that no one else could even go across it. I've had a membership at a rock climbing gym for years now, and I've only until very recently done bouldering about 10 feet high because I was absolutely terrified to go any higher than that. In 2021, I decided to do a deep dive into anxiety. Basically read every book, every clinical handbook and paper I could get my hands on in order to understand not only things like fear of heights, but worry and panic and stress. And really what I see is the primary psychological, psychotectural struggle that people have to deal with today. And of course, using myself as sort of a guinea pig to put these ideas to the test. And the biggest thing I learned is that pretty much everything we hear about anxiety and the way to treat it, the way to cope with it or soothe it is not only wrong, but it's actually counterproductive. It actually makes our anxiety worse in the long term. What I mean by that is that we have everything from meditation to medication, supplements, right? Things that essentially soothe your anxiety in the short term and make it go away so you don't have to deal with it right now. There's a big problem with that, and that is that it is a form of avoidance. It's a form of escape. And that means it teaches your brain that the fear and the danger is all legitimate, and it reinforces that anxiety. When you avoid in any way, and I don't just mean run away from physically, I mean even have thoughts that allow you to avoid actually confronting the anxiety, that actually reinforces that anxiety and perpetuates it in the long run.
You've probably already made attempts to fight or overcome your anxiety, only to find that it remains or is even strengthened by your attempts. And that is why, as I have said before, we have to do the opposite of our natural inclinations. Sometimes anxiety is compared to a Chinese finger trap. You stick a finger into each end of the small toy and try to escape. But you inevitably find that the harder you pull, the more tightly the tube squeezes your fingers, and the more impossible it becomes to get out. Come to think of it, it's pretty strange that this thing ever caught on as a toy. But what you learn when using it is that you have to do the opposite of what seems right. You have to push in with your fingers, allowing the tube to expand and release your fingers. Anxiety works in the same way. Your brain is convinced that the frightening trigger is an actual threat. When you try to fight, escape, or avoid that fear, you merely tell your brain that it's right. You say, "Good job, fear. Keep up the good work." The more you try to escape, the harder it becomes. This is sometimes called the ironic process. Trying to relax and lower your anxiety causes you to check in on the anxiety more often, which leads to increased anxiety.
You've probably heard of exposure therapy, and the fact is that it's a highly proven method. It's not really what people want to hear or want to do, but it's actually effective. It's actually what works. And it doesn't just apply, again, to fears like heights like this. it really applies even to panic attacks. It applies to uncomfortable feelings. It applies to uncomfortable thoughts, right? We want to avoid things that we're scared about, but when we do the opposite of that, when we actually go toward them, when we embrace them, we actually teach our brains, no, anxiety is not legitimate in this case. This is not a real danger, and therefore we can overwrite that fear. Do something that initiates and engages your anxiety. Right? You have to get to a point where you're maybe a 5 out of 10 on the anxiety scale. And once you're there, you have to stay there. You have to not do anything like avoidance. Because if you escape the situation after your anxiety has been triggered, it's going to teach your brain you can't do this, right? And if you sit there and you allow the anxiety to rise and then fall, and then go a little further and then allow it to rise and then fall, you will actually slowly teach your brain this is not a legitimate fear.
In the name of science, I decided to take on this fear and to try to overcome it, to climb this actual rock wall. I guess I thought if I just tried this a lot of times that it would gradually desensitize me and reduce the fear. So I tried it a lot of times and somehow it just wasn't working. I wasn't able to go any higher. When I really thought about it, I realized that I had never been afraid of flying in airplanes or even going on roller coasters, no matter how high they went. And the reason was that I always felt secure in those situations. I never felt like there was a chance of slipping and falling out of an airplane. And yet, even though I was strapped into a harness at a rock climbing gym or a high ropes course, I still felt like there was that chance of slipping and falling. Or better yet, intentionally deciding to jump. Yes, just like the patient with the bridge phobia, I was afraid that I might have an out-of-character lapse of judgment and decide on a whim that it might be fun to jump to my death. We humans are strange creatures. So I went back to the rock climbing gym one last time, strapped in and started climbing. But this time, I was trying to expose myself to the feeling of slipping, not just being high up. As ridiculous as it must have looked to anyone else in the gym, I would climb up a few feet and then, quote, accidentally slip. I would reach for a rock and then say, whoops, and fall off. And then I would go up even higher and do the same thing. This triggered an acute experience of fear in me. But then once I got to the bottom, I would immediately start climbing again, instead of taking off my harness and escaping. Now guys, this method worked, and I mean it really worked. I got to where I was basically turning this into a game, trying to find the most ridiculous ways to accidentally slip off of this wall. I was climbing higher and higher, and eventually I climbed all the way to the top. I know this may not mean much to you, but to me, it was like I had just overcome a lifelong fear in an afternoon. I was shocked, even after I had read so much about how well these methods worked. It did not seem real.
This applies to panic attacks as well. This is something most people don't realize. Panic disorder is extremely treatable. It's possibly the most treatable psychological disorder in existence. Panic attacks are entirely optional, but most people who struggle with them don't know this. The reason why panic attacks exist is that you essentially get caught in an escalating cycle between feelings and thoughts, where you have an uncomfortable feeling, your heart rate increases, your breathing gets faster, your palms start to sweat, and you think to yourself, oh no, this can't be happening. I can't be having a panic attack. And that thought tells your brain that's a legitimate fear. That's a legitimate anxiety. We need more of that. And that escalates your heart rate and your breathing. And this continues until your parasympathetic nervous system steps in and shuts it down. But essentially, you've got this escalating process where your thoughts are reinforcing your fears. Now, if you actually do the opposite of what you want to do in that situation, if you actually tell your brain, this is fine, I'm fine with having a panic attack right now. Actually, I would like for my heart rate to get even faster. I want to fully hyperventilate.
Do not try to relax. I repeat, do not try to relax. Allow the anxiety. Stop fighting it and declare a truce. Choose to allow it to coexist with you. Don't worry about why it's there or what it may mean. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't require anything of you. It has no relevance to you. Just let it be there, give it an acknowledgement, and let it do its worst, which is nothing. Stop playing the game your anxiety wants you to play. Much like an annoying little brother, it will eventually give up on trying to get to you when it learns that it simply can't be done. It isn't fun anymore for your anxiety if it starts being fun for you. You may be reluctant to try this advice because you're not fully convinced that you won't make the anxiety worse and cause some horrible medical issue or embarrassment. But if you can just put it to the test, you'll learn that this isn't what happens. Choosing to actively allow your anxiety doesn't make it worse, counterintuitive as it may be. And even if it did, it wouldn't harm you in any way. This is what study after study have shown. You are not in danger. You are not going to make things worse by allowing it. Interoceptive exposure involves deliberately invoking or exposing yourself to frightening internal feelings. Generally, when traditional exposure therapy doesn't work for a patient's fears, it's because what they were actually afraid of was inside them all along. As we've said, people who struggle with panic are afraid of these sensations of arousal. So we want to deliberately induce these feelings. There are a few different ways to do this. Number 1, deliberately hyperventilating. You can breathe quickly and intensely to create shortness of breath. You can also try breathing through a straw to create this feeling. Number 2, spinning in an office chair to create a feeling of dizziness. 3, running to raise your heart rate. Or drinking caffeine to raise your heart rate. Now, this might sound like a terrible idea, but you are free to research interoceptive exposure if you don't believe me. It's a highly effective practice because it teaches you experientially that these are not dangerous sensations. Identify which sensations you are most worried or afraid of, and find a way to induce them. But take baby steps, just like you're doing with the fear exposure, so you don't overwhelm yourself all at once.
The same applies to worries. It applies to the thoughts you have that keep you up at night, right? You cannot avoid the thoughts, the feelings, whatever it is that you are resisting. You have to stop resisting them. You have to confront them. You have to go toward them. You have to literally embrace them. I know it's extremely counterintuitive, and it really goes against the message that we hear most today, that anxiety is something to be soothed, to be treated, to be avoided at all costs, and maybe just an inevitable part of living in the modern world. Well, I can tell you, as someone who experiences very little anxiety today, someone who has overcome not only this fear of heights I'm talking about, but pretty severe social anxiety in my younger years, you can absolutely get to a place where you don't experience anxiety on a regular basis. And it's always by applying this principle of exposure and embrace of the things that you are currently avoiding.
Embrace the discomfort and approach. Do nothing to resist or fight the anxiety. Embrace is what cuts off the vicious cycle of fear. It's the secret leverage point that takes away anxiety's power. When you understand that discomfort is not a sign of real danger, embrace the fear and learn that you can cope with the anxious feelings. The fear will diminish naturally until it is gone. This idea of embrace applies to specific fears you may struggle with, but it's far deeper than that. Embracing what scares you constitutes a kind of philosophy of life in itself. Some people go through their whole lives with the idea that the world is a dangerous place, and the best strategy for getting through life is to dodge and escape the many threats lurking in the dark. As I said in the intro lesson, fear and anxiety can be compared to waves in the ocean. It's understandable that you would want to avoid the unpleasant storms. It seems like you could be crushed and drowned at any moment. We all crave comfort, and we often just wish the waves would stop crashing down on us. But this is neither the nature of the ocean or of the human experience. Anything other than embracing and learning to love the waves is denial. When you feel a wave of fear coming on, don't resist it. Don't fight it. Don't do anything just yet. Simply float on the wave. Allow the wave to rise and fall. Allow it to pick you up and then gently lower you back down. And notice that when you aren't trying to escape them, these waves can actually be enjoyable. Living with fear and acting in spite of it is your only real option. There is no viable alternative. Pushing through your fears is far less frightening than living in fear and the helplessness that comes along with it. Truly, if you enjoy the feeling of fear, the last thing you want to do is go toward it. Because the more you seek out the frightening, the less fear you will experience on a day-to-day basis. When you practice this process of pushing out of your comfort zone, life becomes your playground instead of a minefield. Fall into the sea of life. Embrace it for all its turbulence. Love it for the turbulence. Seek out the tallest waves you can. Learn from your fears. They point the way to your growth. If you're afraid of something, you not only can overcome those fears, you must. When you choose to keep living a life dwelling in comfort and dodging your fears, you cement your current level of development and allow the resentment to fester.
Now I'm going to be sharing a lot more about anxiety because at this point I feel like this is a topic I have fully mastered, not only in the research and the literature I've read, but also in applying the principles and testing them in my own life. I feel extremely comfortable that I actually know how to get rid of anxiety, right? What's more, I built a 60,000 word comprehensive program on it, spanning from fear, panic, worry, stress, and everyone who has made it to the end of this course has essentially said this was a radically transformative program. So if you struggle with anxiety, worry, stress, these things that you're pretty much told everyone has to deal with today, and you'd like to get rid of them, stick around. I'm going to be sharing a lot more on it. In the meantime, I'm headed back to the US in just a couple days, so I will see you guys soon.